traveler of dreams. Tonight you walk the stars of Middle-earth. Let the world around you fade as we journey beyond the tales of war and shadow, and into the quiet story of an elf whose heart still wandered. This is the tale of Legolas, prince of the woodland realm, whose bow sang through the war of the ring. But this story takes place after the great battles were won and the lands were healing. This is not a tale of battle, but of beauty, silence, and longing. Let go it is, time to dream. The leaves of home, the forest was breathing. It sighed gently beneath the starlit canopy, no longer choked by shadow. Once called Mirkwood, it was now Erinless Galen, the wood of green leaves. The darkness had retreated like a bad dream at sunrise, leaving only morning, dew, chirping sparrows, and a quiet sense of renewal. The silver moon hung above the branches like a guardian spirit, filtering pale light down onto the soft moss and roots below. A thin mist curled around the trunks, painting the night in silver and green. Fireflies glowed like tiny lanterns suspended in time. Legolas stood still. He listened, not just with his ears, but with his entire being. He could hear the language of the leaves again, not the terrified shivering they had once spoken under the shadow of Dol Guldur, but a calm rustling, a song of spring. The trees remembered the pain, but they whispered hope now, healing in their own way. He pressed his palm against the bark of a young oak, warm, alive. His heart beat slower here, but not quite slow enough. It had been only a few moons since the fall of Barad-dûr, since the sky had glowed with the fire of Mount Doom, and he had walked beside men, dwarves, and wizards through lands of ruin. He had seen cities crumble, kings rise, and entire ages end. And now, the stillness felt strange. He was home, and yet not. Legolas wandered the edges of the woodland realm that night. He passed elven watchposts carved into the trunks of great trees. He saw younger elves stringing lights through canopies, their laughter soft and bright. The old paths, once guarded by spiders and ghosts, were now open trails, where deer grazed and foxes peeked out with cautious eyes. The Elven King's halls had changed too. Once dim and stern beneath the hill, now they glowed warmly with golden lanterns and carved ivy. Musicians played lutes in the main chamber. The scent of pine and honey bread drifted through the air. Even the stone itself seemed to breathe easier. And yet Legolas could not settle. He stood on a high ledge that overlooked the forest floor, looking eastward, toward lands he had never known. His bow was still slung across his back, not for war, but for comfort. He returned to the throne room just past midnight. King Thranduil, his father, was alone, sitting on a smooth carved seat beneath a vaulted ceiling where crystal vines shimmered. as if he already knew. "You do not sleep," he said. "The stars are too bright." Legolas replied with a faint smile. "They speak of far places." Thranduil said nothing for a while. The silence was not uncomfortable. "You have changed," he said at last. "Since the war, since the fellowship." "So has the world," Legolas answered, "and yet you still carry your bow." Legolas touched the carved wood gently. "Habit, memory, and perhaps I am not yet done walking." The king leaned back, his face softening in the moonlight. "The forest is healing," Thranduil said, "but our people, they are fading slowly. Even the most ancient roots cannot hold forever." "You feel it too, don't you?" Legolas nodded. "It is not grief," he whispered, "only longing. I want to see what the world will become. I want to feel the breath of the earth beyond these trees." "Then go," said the king. "Follow the river. Let your feet find the songs that have not yet been sung." He rose and stepped closer. They stood silently for a moment, father and son. "But bring back a dream, Legolas. Bring back something worth growing." That night, Legolas sat beside a quiet stream that had once run murky with dark enchantments. Now it was clear and cold, and the fish darted beneath the surface like flickers of silver thought. He dipped his fingers in and traced circles. The starlight danced across the water. A soft wind rustled the reeds. He looked up at the moon again, wondering if it looked the same from Rohan, from Gondor, from the highlands of Eriador. Did it shine as gently upon the towers of Minas Tirith? Did it still linger over the golden fields of Edoras? He thought of Aragorn, now a king, of Gimli, his dearest friend, of Frodo, who had borne a burden so heavy even time itself bent around it. They had all returned to their places, their homes. But what was his place now? Not entirely here, not yet anywhere else. He plucked a leaf from the tree above him. It glowed faintly in the moonlight, veined with green fire. "Where shall I go?" he murmured. The wind curled around him as if answering. The sound of the trees spoke ancient words. "Wherever the light still walks," it seemed to say, and so he made his choice. At dawn, before the first flute of morning rang through the Aesir woodland halls, Legolas prepared to leave. He took no horse, only his bow, a quiver of white-feathered arrows, and a small pack with lembas wrapped in leaf. A group of younger elves watched from the trees as he passed beneath them. They said no words. They only sang. It was a gentle song, an old one, not of sorrow, but of farewell and quiet hope. Their voices floated like mist on the morning air, and Legolas did not turn back. He followed the river south. The trees grew thinner as he walked, their voices softer, but he could still hear them faintly whispering goodbye. And perhaps one day, welcome home. depths of Rivendell. The river led him onward. It sang beneath his feet, curling through stones and reeds, reflecting slivers of sunlight that pierced the branches overhead. As the trees of Aaron Luscallan faded behind him, the land opened like a breath drawn deep after a long sleep. Legolas walked without hurry. His elven feet kissed the earth silently. The days passed like soft pages turning in a book, and with each step, the weight in his chest loosened. Not entirely, but enough. He crossed fields thick with wild flowers and forests where no path had yet been carved. He watched the stars rise over hills unknown and slept beneath them with only the rustle of wind and the sigh of grass as his lullaby. He passed through Lorien, but did not stay long. Galadriel was gone. The woods felt hollow now, like a once golden harp whose strings had been plucked one final time, then laid down. The trees still shimmered in the wind, but they were quiet. Not sad, just still. He touched a mallorn leaf as he passed. "On Namaria," he whispered, and then he continued westward. After a fortnight of quiet travel, the green cliffs and waterfalls of Rivendell rose before him. Imladris, the hidden valley, the last homely house east of the sea. He stood on the ridge above it as twilight settled. Mist wreathed the edges of the valley like soft lace. He could hear the music of the Bruinen River as it rushed along the rocks, silver and fierce. Lanterns twinkled in the trees below, elven lights warm and golden, hanging like starlight caught in glass. He descended slowly. Rivendell was smaller now, less bright, but still full of old magic. The halls carved of stone and song still sang, faintly when you walked through them. Arched bridges crossed narrow streams, and the air always smelled of pine and parchment. He was met by Elladan and Elrohir, the sons of Elrond. They embraced him quietly, brothers of the long twilight, and brought him into the great library where Elrond had once read tales by candlelight. The fire crackled, and the bookshelves whispered with age. "You walk like one seeking something," said Elladan. Legolas nodded. "Not something. A place. A feeling. I cannot name it yet." Elrohir poured warm wine into a carved cup. "This world is changing," he said. "We feel it too." They spoke long into the evening, sharing stories of what remained. The kingdoms of men had grown. Roads were being rebuilt. Trade returned. And yet the elves were leaving. Bit by bit, as the years rolled on, the ships would carry them west, over the sea to Valinor, the undying lands. "Do you wish to go?" asked Legolas. Elladan looked into the fire for a long time. "No," he said quietly. "Not yet. Perhaps not ever. My heart is still bound to Middle-earth." Legolas understood. He spent a week in Rivendell, walking the gardens, meditating beneath willow trees, sitting beside quiet fountains. He read old texts, wrote in the sand with a willow branch, listened to the stories the stone still carried. But every morning he awoke with the same feeling, a quiet urging. He walked the path along the cliffs one dawn, following the river's edge, and paused where a lone tree bent over the water. Its branches hung low, trailing like fingers across the surface. He stood still and listened. The river whispered, but the whisper was not meant to stay. It called him forward. Before he left, Elrohir gifted him a small stone, smooth and black with a spiral of silver within it. It came from the edge of the sea, he said, but it belongs in your hand. Legolas bowed. Thank you. I will carry it until I find where to plant it. And where will you go now? Asked Elladan. Legolas looked south. To Minas Tirith, he said, the White City. I would see what has become of the world of men. The sons of Elrond walked with him as far as the borders of the valley, where the hills rose gently like waves of green earth. They embraced one last time. We may not see each other again, said Elrohir softly. Then may the stars watch you, Legolas answered, always. And he walked on. He followed the great east road, which curved through Eregion, where once the elves of old had forged the rings of power. The ruins were now covered in ivy and silence. Crows watched from broken towers, but even here, spring was returning. Wildflowers broke through the stones. He passed shepherds who waved in curiosity, and travelers who whispered that he must be one of the fair folk, come down from the hills. Few remembered what the elves had once been. Fewer still had seen one with their own eyes. He smiled softly and walked on, leaving no footprints behind. He traveled for days more, through foothills and meadows, until finally Whitestone shimmered on the horizon like a dream. Minas Tirith, the city of kings, the White City at dusk. The wind smelled different here. It carried the scent of stone warmed by sun, of olive trees swaying in the high gardens, and distant wood smoke curling up from the hearths of the city. The breeze from the Anduin River whispered up the mountain. Slopes like a sigh returned from the sea. Legolas stood upon a low ridge as the golden light of evening bathed the land. Before him, carved into the rock like a crown upon the brow of the world, stood Minas Tirith, the White City of Gondor. It rose in 7 terraces, layered like steps reaching for the stars. Towers gleamed with banners that fluttered gently, and the great walls caught the last rays of sunlight, glowing softly against the shadowed backdrop of Mount Mindalluin. The war was long over now. Peace hummed gently through the stones, though they still bore the memories of fire and siege. But the city lived. Children played played in the alleys. Lanterns flickered in windows. Laughter rose like chimes through the cool air. Legolas entered the city through the great gate, rebuilt and stronger now, yet elegant in design. The guards, though surprised, let him pass without question. "An elf here," whispered one. "They said he walked with the king." He smiled softly and continued upward, climbing the broad, winding paths toward the highest level. As he walked, people turned to watch. Some bowed. Others stared in awe or whispered softly, but he paid them no mind. His thoughts were on a man he had once followed through fire and shadow. A man crowned now, not with leaves of silver, but with duty. He reached the court of the fountain, where the white tree had once stood bare, silent through long years. But now it bloomed. Its bark shone like moonlight, and its branches carried blossoms of pale gold and snow-white petals. The tree stood tall, proud once more, a sign of hope, restored. Birds nestled in its branches, singing soft songs at twilight. Legolas approached in reverence. He touched a falling petal as it drifted on the wind. It landed in his hand, warm from the last touch of sun. "She sings again," came a voice behind him. He turned. Aragorn stood there, dressed not in royal finery, but in simple robes of deep blue and gray. His crown was absent, his hair tied back. Yet still he stood as a king. The two embraced silently. "You came," Aragorn said. "The wind called me," Legolas replied. They stood together before the white tree, saying little. The sun dipped low behind the mountains, casting a golden veil across the city. "Gondor thrives," Legolas said. "It is beginning to," Aragorn replied. "But it is slow. The world does not change overnight. We rebuild one stone at a time." They walked together through the upper gardens, past ivy-covered walls and quiet pools. The scent of jasmine drifted on the evening breeze. Below, lights bloomed like stars across the terraces, and the hum of life rose upward. "Do you feel it?" Aragorn asked as they paused beside a fountain. "The fading?" Legolas nodded. "Yes. Even now, the land is awake, but it remembers." Aragorn sat on the low edge of the fountain. His face, though strong, bore the lines of years lived deeply. "You will leave one day," he said, "across the sea." Legolas looked to the west. "Perhaps, but not yet. Not while there is still music in the leaves. Not while there is still something to grow." They sat together, saying nothing, as the stars unveiled themselves above. Later, Aragorn brought him to a small chambers near the citadel. Inside were scrolls, maps, and a single candle burning low. "I have something for you," the king said. He unrolled a parchment. It was a map, drawn by hand. It showed Ithilien, east of the Anduin, green and wild, its borders still marked as untamed. The Southrons are gone. The land is quiet again, but no one lives there now. Not truly. I thought. Perhaps Legolas ran his fingers over the inked lines. Mountains, rivers, woods, a blank canvas, a garden, he whispered. Aragorn nodded. A haven for your people, for the trees, for peace. Legolas did not speak for a long time. His heart stirred, not with restlessness, but with purpose. He spent 3 nights in the White City. Each evening he walked the high paths and watched the lights flicker across the plains. He spoke with healers tending the sick, gardeners replanting the old terraces, and masons carving new symbols into the gates. Ithilion's first dawn. The land unfolded before him like an untouched scroll. Ithilien, the green jewel of Gondor, once scarred by war, now whispered softly in its long sleep. The mountains rose to the east like protective arms, and the Anduin shimmered to the west, winding like a silver thread through the distance. Legolas crossed the river by a small elven boat gifted by Aragorn's people. He stood at the helm, still as a statue, letting the wind and current guide him. Mist clung to the water. The reeds bent gently as he passed. On the far bank, he stepped onto soft earth. The moment his foot touched the grass, the air changed. It smelled of damp stone, old roots, and the promise of blooming things. He paused and knelt down, pressing his palm into the ground. "You are still dreaming," he whispered, "but I am here now." He began to walk, not with haste, but with reverence. Ithilien was wild. Vines crept up ancient ruins, half swallowed by the forest. Trees with trunks broad as gates towered overhead, their leaves golden and green, even in spring. Birds circled in the canopies. Deer watched from thickets with wide, wondering eyes. He found the remnants of an old garden, once tended by the men of Gondor, perhaps in the days before the shadow. Stone walls lay crumbled, half lost beneath moss, but beneath the brokenness, life remained. A single lily grew between 2 shattered tiles. He smiled and knelt before it. "You remember beauty," he said. "So shall I." He made camp beneath a great cedar. The branches formed a natural roof, and the roots shaped a kind of seat. As dusk fell, the air grew thick with the sounds of unseen life. Chirping insects, owls calling to one another, the wind tracing secrets through the trees. Legolas did not light a fire. Instead, he listened to the rhythm of the leaves, to the memories held in bark and stone, to the question that lived in the silence. Could this be home? The next morning, he woke with the sun filtered gold through the branches. The birds were louder here, joyful even. A fox darted past his camp, pausing to sniff the air before vanishing into ferns. He rose, stretched, and wandered deeper into the woods. There, among a ring of standing stones, he found it. A glade untouched by time. Tall oaks circled the clearing, like guardians, and wildflowers bloomed in brilliant color across the grass. Violet, pale yellow, blue like sky caught in petal form. A small spring bubbled from the hillside and fed into a clear pool. Legolas stepped into the center, heart full. "This is the place," he whispered. He dropped to his knees, pulled the stone Elrohir had given him from his pouch, and pressed it into the soil beside the spring. "Let this be the seed," he said, "from which something beautiful will grow." He remained there until the sun reached its highest point, and in that quiet glade something stirred. Not magic exactly, but a possibility, the beginning of a dream. He built little, no walls, no towers, only woven canopies between trees, carved seats grown from living roots, paths marked by shells and polished stones. He planted where he could, elm, birch, and sapling. "Malern," he whispered to them as they grew, "you are safe here. Grow slowly. Dream freely." Elves came in time. Not many, but some. Wanderers from Lothlorien, where Galadriel's light had dimmed. Others from the scattered glades of the north. Even a few younglings from Erin Lesgallen, curious and bright-eyed. They came without summons, drawn by the air, the quiet, the song of trees recovering their voices. They called it Las Leylanda, haven of green echoes, and slowly Ithilien bloomed. But even as he nurtured the land, Legolas remained a traveler in his own heart. Each evening he walked the outer edges of the glade, listening, not to protect, but to remember the world beyond. He spoke to the stars as they rose. "Thank you," he whispered, "for watching, for waiting." The trees answered him in rustling lullabies. The wind danced through the leaves. The river sang in the distance, and he, once a prince, once a warrior, once a wanderer, became a gardener of silence. Echoes of Lothlorien. The spring rains had passed. The air smelled of green again. In the quiet heart of Ithilien, soft petals floated in shallow pools, and the trees that Legolas had planted were beginning to root deeper, their leaves unfurling with gentle purpose. Birds nested in their branches, and wildflowers danced in the meadows between the glades. Yet in all this blooming, something was missing. A light, a shimmer, a memory not yet returned. So, when the winds shifted one dawn and the sun rose silver behind the clouds, Legolas heard it again, soft, distant, like the last note of a harp fading on the breeze. Lothlorien was calling, not as it once was, not in power or splendor, but like a leaf drifting downstream, quiet, fragile, glowing still with the echo of something ancient. He told told no one where he was going. He took only his bow, a short blade of white steel, and a pouch of lembas. He left at twilight, walking west beneath a sky painted with streaks of gold and lavender. The moon followed him, rising gently behind the mountains. He walked for 5 days across lowlands blanketed with fog, past broken towers where ivy had claimed every stone. He forded the narrow streams that curled between forgotten meadows. His steps were light, but his thoughts were heavy with remembrance. He passed through the fields of Parthgalen, where once the fellowship had been sundered. He paused there, beneath the darkening boughs, and laid his palm against a smooth, moss-covered rock. "I remember you, Boromir," he whispered, and the sound of horns, the clash of swords, the courage in your final breath. Then he moved. Lothlorien was smaller than he remembered, or perhaps the world had grown larger. The trees still stood, tall and pale and golden, but their song was quieter now, like a distant dream you try to recall upon waking. The grass beneath his feet was soft with dew. The air held the same fragrance, malorn leaves and memory. And though many of the Galadrim had sailed west, the forest was not empty. It simply slept. He walked the familiar path toward Cairn Amroth, the heart of Lorien, where once Aragorn had spoken of love, and where the world had seemed untouched by time. Now the hill was bare, the flats were empty, their rope ladders long vanished. But the view remained. From the hilltop he looked out across the forest, an ocean of golden leaves trembling beneath the wind. He sat there until moonrise, and then he sang, not loudly, not to summon, but to honor a quiet elven hymn, wordless, filled with longing and light, a song not of sadness, but of reverence, a lullaby for a forest growing old. The trees listened, and as the last note faded into the night, something stirred. He found it beneath an ancient tree, one older than even the Mellarns. A single silver bloom growing alone in a patch of moss. It shimmered faintly, glowing from within. He knelt beside it and touched its petals. "You stayed," he murmured. The flower didn't speak, but in its presence he felt her, Galadriel, not as a person, but as a presence, the soft pressure of grace lingering in the air, the way morning light touches a still lake. Not memory, not illusion, just essence. He took the bloom, not plucked, but lifted carefully, roots and all, into a velvet pouch wrapped in golden thread. "You will bloom again," he promised, "where the world is still young." As he turned to leave the glade, a single Mallarn leaf drifted down from above. He caught it midair. Its edges sparkled just briefly, before fading to a soft autumn gold. A farewell, a blessing. The journey back to Ithilien felt shorter, his feet passed the same stones. He did not sleep much on the road, yet he was not weary. The flower pulsed gently with warmth through the pouch, as though cradling a heartbeat not quite its own. When he returned, the trees of Ithilien bowed in the wind. He entered the glade in silence, lit only by the silver moon, and knelt at the center, the same place he had once planted the dark stone from Rivendell. Now, beside it, he dug a small hollow in the earth. He placed the silver flower there, cupping it gently, and whispered in Elvish, "Grow in peace, shine in shadow, remind the world what once was, and what still might be." He covered the roots with soil, watered it with spring water from the pool nearby, and pressed his palm to the earth. The wind stopped. For a moment, everything listened, and then a single note. A soft chime, like crystals struck in a dream. The trees swayed in unison, and a pale glow bloomed from the ground. A flower had opened, and with it a light not of fire, nor of sun, but of remembrance, of Lothlorien, of Galadriel, of the elves who once walked between worlds. Legolas closed his eyes and exhaled. "Welcome home," he whispered. "The stone and the flame." The days passed softly in Ithilien. Sunlight wandered slowly through the canopies, touching everything with golden fingers. The silver-blossomed flower from Lothlorien had taken root. Its glow was steady now, no longer pulsing, but resting like a heartbeat in slumber. Legolas walked the glades each morning, barefoot, listening to the trees. He whispered names into the wind, names of friends, places, rivers, and stars long gone. The woods held them gently, like lullabies in the soil. The elves who had come to live among the trees tended gardens, carved flutes from fallen branches, and bathed in the singing streams. They moved softly, but they were not ghosts. They were growing slowly, quietly, like moss on stone. And then one morning, as birds sang over a warming breeze, a voice broke the hush, like thunder wrapped in laughter. "Elves," the voice bellowed, "where's that pointy-eared leaf lover?" Legolas froze mid-step and smiled. "Gimli," he said aloud. The dwarf came into view down the path, beard braided in thick knots, helmet glinting despite the lack of war. He carried a bag that looked much too heavy for a visit, and eyes that sparkled beneath his frown. "You built a forest without me," Gimli said, stomping up to him, "and here I thought we were partners." Legolas inclined his head. "Ithilien was calling," he replied, "but you were always coming." Gimli snorted. "Phew, at least you left the rocks alone." They walked the glade together, the dwarf marveling at the trees, grumbling about how tall they were, but secretly admiring them. "You're lucky I brought my hands," Gimli muttered. and my hammers. I thought, if you're building your little elf garden, it's going to need something solid, something with weight. Roots are lovely, but they need stone, Legolas smiled. Then let us build something together. And so they did. Not a palace, not a tower, but a stone hall nestled into the hillside, with ivy for a roof and skylights that opened to the stars. Inside were carvings, stories of the Fellowship, of Fangorn Forest, of Moria and Lothlorien. Gimli sculpted a pillar shaped like Galadriel's hand, and another shaped like a tree growing from a mountain. "This one's for you," he told Legolas. Leaf and stone, sun and flame. The elves sang as they built. The dwarf grumbled as he carved, but the result was harmony. Evenings were filled with firelight and stories. Gimli sat with his back to a mossy boulder, smoking a pipe carved from oak. Elves danced slowly beneath the stars, and Legolas sang in a voice as soft as falling snow. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, listening to the crackle of the fire, the chirping of night birds, the heartbeat of the earth. "You won't stay forever," Gimli said one night, staring into the flames. Legolas looked up. The moon cast a silver line across the water. "No," he replied, "but not yet." Gimli nodded. "Then neither will I." And so the dwarf stayed. Seasons turned. The trees grew taller. The roots deepened. The birds returned in flocks, and the rivers ran clearer than ever before. Ithilien became a song, not loud, not glorious, but peaceful, warm, full of memory and the rhythm of two friends who had chosen to grow side by side, even if their stories had begun in different mountains, different woods. One morning, Legolas placed a hand upon the silver-blossomed flower. It shimmered softly at his touch. He looked to the west, and the sea was calling. The last ship, the whisper of the sea had become louder, not in sound, but in feeling. It curled beneath the wind, tugged gently at the heart, and shimmered in the corners of Legolas's dreams, like foam at the edge of a shore never seen. The trees of Ithilien still sang to him, but their song had changed. It was softer now, a lullaby for something about to sleep. He walked the garden paths as autumn arrived. The silver-blossomed flower from Lothlorien still bloomed, though the leaves around it had turned golden and began to fall. Slowly, one by one, birds still circled in the skies, but they flew lower, as if waiting, as if they too sensed that something was ending. One evening, beneath the stars, Legolas found Gimli sitting alone on a low stone bench carved with runes. The dwarf had grown older, his beard streaked with more gray, his eyes more tired, but his spirit, like fire beneath a mountain, had not dimmed. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Legolas spoke. It is no longer distant. Gimli gave a short grunt. About time. I do not wish to leave what we have made, and yet you must. The wind rustled the trees gently. The moon hung like a pale lantern overhead. You'll take the ship then? Gimli asked. Yes, said Legolas. A ship of my own making, not from the harbors of the elves, not from the Grey Havens. Then you'll need wood, the dwarf muttered, and a good keel. None of your delicate elven nonsense. I'll not be carried over the sea in a basket of flower petals. Legolas turned, his brow lifting. Gimli, the dwarf looked up. Yes. Would you come with me? A long silence. Then the dwarf stood, brushing moss from his tunic. You're going to need someone to keep you from singing the whole way. And so, the ship was begun, not in haste, but with reverence. They built it together beneath the trees of Ithilien, along the river's edge, where the Anduin widened and grew slow and deep. Legolas chose the wood, white birch, golden elm, cedar that sang when carved. Gimli laid the stones in the base for balance, for memory, for strength. The sail was silver and stitched with the patterns of stars. The prow was carved into the shape of a swan, but its wings bore the marks of stone, leaf and mountain, light and fire. By the time the ship was ready, the glades had grown quiet. The elves who had come with Legolas were already fading. Some had left in the night, their footprints vanishing behind them. Others stood at the water's edge, singing songs of farewell that mingled with the river mist. On the final morning, Legolas walked alone through the glade. He touched the bark of every tree, brushed his fingers through the flowers, whispered names into the soil. Then he returned to the boat. Gimli was already aboard, hammering something with his usual frown. If this thing sinks, I'll haunt you across the ocean, he grumbled. Legolas only smiled. It will float. The sea is waiting. They pushed off at twilight. No crowd stood watching, only the birds, the trees, the stars. The boat drifted silently down the river, its sail catching the last blush of sun. As they passed beneath the overhanging boughs, petals fell gently onto the deck, tiny farewells from the land they had loved. Legolas did not look back. Gimli did, just once. It was a good place, the dwarf whispered, for stone and leaf alike. Legolas nodded. We made it so. As night deepened, the ship reached the mouth of the river and kissed the sea. The stars opened overhead like silver blossoms at Soshasa. The void, the water beneath them shimmered, catching their light. No storm greeted them, only stillness, the kind of stillness that waits at the end of a song. Legolas stood at the bow. He closed his eyes, and he heard it. A new song, distant no longer, the voices of elves who had gone before. Galadriel, Elrond, Frodo. He heard the coast of Valinor far ahead. He felt the wind of a land untouched by grief. Beside him, Gimli leaned against the mast. "Will there be stone?" the dwarf asked. "White cliffs," Legolas replied softly, "and halls brighter than crystal, and trees that remember the first light." Gimli muttered, "As long as there's ale," Legolas laughed, the sound low and warm. "We'll build a bench, my friend, beneath a tree that never sheds its leaves, and we'll sit, as we did in Ithilien." Gimli grunted, "That sounds just fine." And so they sailed, not fast, not rushed, but gently, into the light, into the end of stories, and the beginning of rest. And behind them, in Ithilien, the trees swayed one last time, and the silver flower continued